Hi everyone, welcome to Ask a Property Manager episode 69. Today is May 5th, 2021. We're coming to you from Studio 2.0 here at Own Buffalo. I'm Andrew Schultz, principal broker of Own Buffalo Inc. And on today's show, we're going to be talking about the extension of the New York State Eviction and Foreclosure Moratoria. We're going to talk about Denver, Colorado, passing some legislation requiring landlords to become licensed. And we'll answer some questions from housing providers from around the country and so much more. Before we do all of that, we're going to go ahead and plug our social media. New episodes of Ask a Property Manager every Wednesday, 10 a.m. Eastern, live on our Facebook page. You can also catch the replays the same day on our Facebook page as well as on our YouTube page, youtube.com/ownbuffalo. Don't forget about our Instagram as well. Jumping over to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast, a new episode of the podcast drops tomorrow on Thursday. We're going to be taking a look at what to do when a tenant wants to have a guest, lawn maintenance agreements in leases, and we're also going to talk about pest control for rentals. Essentially, where do you draw the line when it comes to pest control? So don't miss out on that. New episodes of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast drop every other Thursday, anywhere podcasts are heard or over at rentprep.com/podcast. We're going to go ahead and jump right into the news of the day here, starting with obviously the big story. Governor Cuomo signs extension of the COVID-19 Emergency Eviction and Foreclosure Prevention Act of 2020 and the COVID-19 Emergency Protect Our Small Businesses Act of 2021. Quite a mouthful. Governor Cuomo today signed an extension of the COVID-19 Emergency Eviction and Foreclosure Prevention Act of 2020 and the COVID-19 Emergency Protect Our Small Businesses Act. This legislation extends protections prohibiting residential and commercial evictions, foreclosure proceedings, credit discrimination, and negative credit reporting related to the COVID-19 pandemic until August 31, 2021. This legislation adds to New York State's efforts to protect tenants and homeowners from the economic hardship incurred as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic at a critical time in the pandemic's trajectory, as the state begins to lift restrictions on public gatherings and businesses. As we approach the light at the end of the COVID-19 tunnel, it is critical that we continue to protect both New York's tenants and business owners who have suffered tremendous hardships throughout this entire pandemic, Governor Cuomo said. Extending this legislation will ensure that vulnerable New Yorkers and business owners who are facing eviction through no fault of their own are able to keep their homes and businesses as we continue on the road to recovery and begin to build back our economy better than it was before. Senate Housing Committee Chair and bill sponsor Brian Kavanaugh said, the COVID-19 numbers in New York continue to be stubbornly high throughout the state, and we need public health measures like the Eviction Moratorium to keep New Yorkers safe and ultimately to get past this terrible pandemic as soon as possible. The CDC have specifically found that permitting evictions increases the spread of COVID-19, and the moratorium laws like New York work to prevent transmission. Ensuring that everyone has access to a stable, safe place to live is always a priority, but has never been more important than it is right now. Assemblyman Jeffrey Dinowitz said, I am very pleased that the Assembly passed this critical legislation that will help keep people in their homes and small business owners in their stores. This is life-changing legislation that allows New York State Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance and other relevant agencies to more time to disperse the billions of dollars in state and federal funding to people who need it. We'll be talking about that in just a minute. We are still in the midst of a global pandemic and the worst economic crisis of our lives. I believe it would be immoral to allow the current moratorium to lapse. The law will save lives. The previous enacted legislation helps both residential and commercial tenants facing evictions and mortgagors facing foreclosure proceedings due to the pandemic. Residential evictions. The legislation places a moratorium on residential evictions until August 1, 2021 for those tenants who have endured COVID-related hardship. Tenants must submit a hardship declaration or document explaining the source of the hardship to prevent the eviction. Landlords can evict tenants that are creating safety or health hazards for other tenants and those who do not submit hardship declarations. Residential foreclosures. Legislation also places a moratorium on residential foreclosure proceedings until August 1, 2021. Homeowners and small landlords who own 10 or fewer residential dwellings can file hardship declarations with their mortgage lender, other foreclosing party, or a court that would prevent a foreclosure. Commercial evictions. Legislation places a moratorium on evictions until August 1, 2021 for commercial tenants have endured COVID-related hardship. The legislation applies to small businesses with under 50 employees that demonstrate a financial hardship. Tenants must submit a hardship declaration or a document explaining the source of the hardship to prevent eviction. Commercial foreclosure proceedings, the legislation places a moratorium on commercial foreclosure proceedings until August 1. Tax lien sales. The legislation prevents local governments from engaging in a tax lien sale or a tax foreclosure until at least August 1, 2021. Payments due to the locality are still due. Credit discrimination, negative reporting. Lending institutions are prohibited from discriminating against a property owner seeking credit because the property owner has been granted a stay of mortgage, foreclosure proceedings, tax foreclosure proceedings, or tax lien sales. They are also prohibited from discriminating because the owner is in arrears and has filed a hardship declaration with the lender. Senior citizen homeowner exemption and disabled homeowner exemption. Local governments are required to carry over SCHE and DHC exemptions from the 2020 assessment roll to the 2021 assessment roll at the same levels. They're also required to provide renewal applications for anyone who may be eligible for a larger exemption in 21. Localities can set the procedures by which assessors can require renewal applications from people who the assessors believe may no longer be eligible for an exemption in 2021. Recipients of the exemption do not have to file renewal applications in person. Governor Cuomo first announced a state moratorium on residential and commercial evictions on March 20 to ensure no tenant was evicted during the height of the public health emergency. I believe that's March 2020, not March 20, 2021. The governor signed the Tenant Safe Harbor Act on June 30th, 2020, which became effective immediately, as well as additional legislation providing financial assistance to renters and landlords. Additionally, executive orders have prohibited charges or fees for late rent payments. And tenants facing financial hardship can still use their security deposit as payment to repay their security deposit over time. So that's the press release from the governor's office. We'll take a quick look here. This is the Senate bill. You can see that it shows as delivered to the governor. And then on the Assembly bill, you can see signed by governor, current bill status via S6362, which is the parent bill to 6362A, which is that one there. So let's go ahead and take a quick gander at this legislation. I went ahead and highlighted the pertinent sections here. We're just going to skip ahead. For the most part, what you're seeing here is the red crossouts are what's being eliminated, and the green additions are what they are adding. So what we're going to do is just scroll down here. And this is where we get into the section where it's relevant to us for residential. And you can see basically it's just date changes from May 1st to August 31st, from May 1st to August 31st, from May 1st to August 31st. So I think that the press conference, or the press release, excuse me, is incorrect, because the press release is saying August 1, but the actual legislation is saying August 31. So I'm assuming that the press release is wrong and that the actual legislation does extend through August 31. Everything else I'm reading surrounding this is saying August 31. So that's the date that we're rolling with. That's the date that's in the legislation here. I'm not going to sit and read through all this. It's basically just rehashing everything that we had in the press release. But I did want to point this out, that it does say August 31 and not August 1, as it does indicate in the press release. So if you're interested in finding this piece of legislation, you can either email me and I will send it over to you. You can send an email to hello@ownbuffalo.com. Alternatively, you can go to the New York State Senate or New York State Assembly website and just type in the bill number. The Assembly bill is A7175A, and the Senate bill is S6362A. So if you want to take a look at those two bills, you can get the full text and do a breakdown just the same way I did, so that you can see exactly what's going on. But that's where we stand right now. The residential and commercial eviction and foreclosure moratoriums have been extended to August 31st, 2021. The interesting things that I've pulled out of this press conference, this press release, landlords can evict tenants that are creating health and safety hazards for other tenants. That's been the case pretty much the entire way along, but find a court that's actually hearing those cases, because I've yet to hear a single landlord that has been successful in the state of New York having a tenant removed from an apartment based on a health and safety hazard. Because honestly, if it was something that was successful, we would be doing it here in our office. We have a couple of tenants that are in that exact situation, and we've been struggling and struggling and struggling this entire time. It's a real big headache for us. And those tenants who do not submit hardship declarations. So that tells me that if your tenant has not submitted that hardship declaration, you should be able to move forward with an eviction. Does that mean that the courts are going to open and start hearing some of these eviction cases? That's kind of a question mark at this point, as far as I can tell. I don't have knowledge of anything on that as of yet. If I do find anything out, I will certainly let you know. It obviously applies to residential evictions and commercial evictions, as well as residential and commercial foreclosure proceedings. You have to be 10 or fewer residential dwellings. It doesn't say how many doors, just says 10 or fewer residential dwellings. I believe they consider a residential dwelling here in New York to be anything 1 to 4 units. So I guess technically you could be up to 40 doors and still technically qualify for foreclosure prevention. Based on how I'm reading this, it might be completely inaccurate, but the way I'm reading it is 10 or fewer residential dwellings. That would be the actual structure. So if you have a 4-unit structure, I would think that that would count as one dwelling, at least in my mind. Who knows what the state would say on that. And then moving down a little bit further, the tax lien sales, those are also put on hold until August 1st. I'm going to assume that's also going to be August 31st. And payments to the locality are still due. So you still have to pay your taxes, even if you're not getting any rent money through the door. So I did want to touch base real quickly on the financial assistance to residential renters and landlords. New York State has had, we're in the round 2 now of the rent relief program, and I've yet to hear of a single property owner or a single tenant that has been able to access these funds and receive these funds as they're supposed to be distributed. If you've been successful, I want to interview you. Call our office, send me an email. I want to talk to you if you've been successful on the tenant side or on the landlord side in accessing any of the rental relief funds here in the state of New York. I know we talked a couple weeks ago about the first round of the rent relief funds, where it was less than 50% of the funds had been distributed. It was in the high 40s, I believe, of funds were actually distributed. And the rest of that money was never distributed. The program ended and that money got swept into the state's general budget, is my understanding, which really annoys me. And in round 2, I've yet to hear anybody receiving anything. Which, is this just another ploy to, and I'm putting my tinfoil hat on here, is this just another ploy for the state to say, oh, well, we weren't able to distribute all these funds, the program's now closed, we're going to swoosh this money into the general fund as well, because New York State's operating at a massive budget deficit. I don't think that's anybody's surprise. We had a budget deficit of, I believe, 5 or 6 billion coming into the coronavirus pandemic, and it's just gotten worse since, obviously. So that's a situation that I almost wonder what's going on there, like what's happening behind the scenes. Why is it so difficult to access these funds, especially when we're being told that landlords can apply for these funds on behalf of tenants, but there seems to be no mechanism in place by which to do any of this, is basically what I'm getting at. So, and we've done research, extensive research, trying to figure out how to make this happen. So if I've missed something, if you're a landlord or a tenant and you've been able to access these funds, I want to talk to you. Reach out to us. Our office number is 716-608-3200. You can also send us an email, hello@ownbuffalo.com. You don't have to come on the show if you don't want to come on the show. It can be completely anonymous if you want, but I'm really, really curious to see how many people have actually been able to access these funds in the face of these eviction moratoria that are continually extended. We're just kicking the can down the road. It's frustrating for sure, in my opinion, because from where I'm sitting, there's a huge need for these rent relief funds, and it's just not being distributed. It's not great for tenants. It's not great for landlords. It's not great for anybody in this situation. So that's where we sit on the current state of the eviction moratoria here in the state of New York. Doesn't mean that you are 100% barred from any eviction whatsoever. It's just going to be very, very select evictions that are heard, if any are heard at all. Like I said, it's, finding courts that are willing to take on cases. It's very much a challenge here currently. So we're going to move on to our next article. This one is actually out of Denver. This one's coming out of the Denver Post. Denver landlords need long-term rental licenses under a new law. We're going to go ahead and jump right into this article. Denver landlords will be required to hold long-term rental licenses for each of their properties under a new law unanimously approved by the City Council on Monday night. In what is believed to be the largest overhaul of the city's licensing department, the licenses will take a couple of years to phase in and hundreds of thousands of dollars just to get started, sponsor City Council President Stacey Gilmore said. As the council considered the new law in recent weeks, renters voiced concern that requiring the licenses for an estimated 54,000 homes, condos, row houses, and apartments will increase their rents, while landlords complained of the additional red tape that impede business and lead to costly repairs. But Gilmore and others on the council argued against both points and said that licenses will protect tenants and help city staff to keep tabs on landlords. This is a basic responsibility of a city the size of Denver, that we all know what our housing stock is and that it meets basic habitation rules, Council President Pro Tem Jamie Torres said. Before receiving the licenses, landlords must have their properties examined by certified inspectors. According to the measure, at least 10% of a property's units must be inspected at random. The landlord can apply for early licensing starting next year. Landlords renting 2 or more units on a single property, like apartments and row homes, must obtain a license by January 1, 2023. It's a year later for landlords who rent single living spaces like homes or ADUs. The application fee will be $50, and licensing fees will range from $50 for single units to $500 for properties with more than 250 units, the measure said. Landlords must renew their licenses every 4 years, paired with new inspections. The new law will also create a database of landlords and their properties, Gilmore said. This will enable city officials to track available housing stock and communicate with property owners and tenants about rental and utility assistance efforts. Officials will be able to find problematic landlords, suspend or revoke licenses. If the latter two happen, Gilmore said tenants would still be allowed to stay in place through the end of their lease. Money raised by the fees will be more than enough to cover the administrative costs of the new licensing program, Gilmore said. We're going to break this one down a little bit too. I'll start this by saying we do have here in the Buffalo market, in the city of Buffalo, rental registration, which is essentially what's required of a landlord when they're using a property as a rental. It also names, if that person's using a property manager, it names the local agent. It's required to have a local agent if you live outside of the Western New York region, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem I have with it is that from where I sit here, living in the Buffalo market and doing the rental registrations and everything, doesn't really seem to do anything. There's no inspection at the onset or a renewal inspection or anything like that. There's not really, I see it as basically a cash grab. It's not as though anybody really has access to this database other than that department that handles the rental registration to find out any information about, who owns or who's managing a property, who's responsible for a property. For instance, if the Buffalo police were to respond to an incident at one of our properties and they needed to contact us for access to a unit, for instance, it's not as though the City of Buffalo Police Department can just pull up on their computers in their cars and get our contact info and call us. It's not like that information is readily accessible to them. The information sits in a database with limited access. It's a pure money grab here in Buffalo, at least in my opinion. And honestly, I kind of see this one in Denver as being the same thing. You have opposition on both sides, the landlord and the tenant side, both saying, we don't want this legislation. It doesn't do any good for anybody involved. The city still pushes it through despite the fact. Why would they do that? So, moving further on down the article, before receiving a license, landlords must have their properties examined by a certified inspector according to the measure. What is a certified inspector? Are we talking about somebody has to come in and do a home inspection? Are we talking about a code enforcement officer has to come in and make sure the unit is up to code? I don't know if it's spelled out more in the actual legislation. I haven't read the legislation, but that seems pretty vague to me. The application fee, it is what it is. That's one of those things, it's a registration fee. It's a money grab. Officials will be able to fine problematic landlords, suspend or revoke licenses. If the latter two happen, Gilmore said tenants would still be allowed to stay in the place through the end of their lease. Well, after the end of their lease, that tenant now has to move. So now you're reducing overall housing stock by revoking a landlord's license to operate. And who knows what causes these revocations. I'm assuming that it's going to be, you're not fixing things or whatever the case may be. But if you have a landlord that has, let's say a landlord has 10 buildings with 2 units in each building. If you revoke their license on building 1, does that mean that buildings 2 through 10 are also license revoked? Or is it tied to the landlord or is it tied to the property? If it's tied to the landlord and you terminate that landlord's license, you now have 20 fewer units in your housing stock until that landlord is able to reapply and get his license reinstated. That's not really great. The last point I wanted to touch on, money raised by the fees will be more than enough to cover the administrative costs of the new licensing program, Gilmore said. That's why I'm calling money grab. I understand that there is a certain base level that housing needs to be kept at to be habitable. I think we're all in agreement that housing should be kept at that level. But I don't know as though this is the best route to go about doing it. This to me feels like a government program very much similar to the program that we have here in Buffalo, which in my opinion is just kind of a money grab. The rental registration process, the access to the data is limited. I've never really had any, positive experience as a result of it, or negative experience as a result of rental reg, other than having to pay the fee. But when you pay a fee and you get nothing in return other than the joy of filling out some paperwork, what's the point? Like, what exactly is it that you're really trying to accomplish here? So that's my thoughts. Your thoughts may differ. Let me know, tenant or landlord. We do get tenants that watch the show occasionally. If you're a tenant, would you be in favor of something like this? If you're a landlord, are you in favor of something like this? Or do you just think that it's a bridge too far? Let us know down in the comments. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. It's interesting to see more and more areas pushing more and more legislation in the middle of a pandemic when it's a lot more difficult to fight everything on so many fronts. So let's go ahead and jump into some toilet humor, should we? I don't understand when people do design. Like, obviously, this is an older home that's been modified and things like that, but what a crazy bathroom that is. Are you really planning on having lunch while somebody's using the bathroom? And then this one is also unique. I just don't understand. First of all, I love that style of toilet with the tank that's way up high and everything like that. I think those are crazy every time I see them. But, like, why would you leave this in place? It just doesn't make any sense to me. How did this even happen in the first place? It just doesn't make sense to me. I'd like to think that that's fake, but it looks to me as though it's 100% legitimate based on the way that the toilet is set up. It's pretty crazy. So very interesting. Let's go ahead and jump into our questions from housing providers around the country. Full year of rent up front. So someone offered to pay me the whole year's rent up front. In all my years as a landlord, I've never encountered this. I haven't responded to that as of yet. Just told them to fill out the application form and we will go from there. But hit me up with all the pros and cons. I'm especially interested in the cons. Well, there's one big pro. Actually, before we get to the pros, let's touch on state law. Check your state laws before you jump into a situation where you accept a full year of rent up front. Here in the state of New York, as of 2019, when they passed HSTPA, you can only hold 1 month of rent as a security deposit or as a prepaid rent, no more. So you can't do a full year of rent up front in the state of New York anymore by law. So that's something to keep in mind. Check your state laws to see what the allowances are in your area. You may have to do something special with the funds. You may have to hold the funds in escrow and you can only draw down 1 month of rent on the first of every month or something like that. So as far as pros go, full year of rent means no chasing rents, which could be huge during, the middle of a pandemic. It could be great to have that entire year's rent up front and not have to worry about chasing that rent. You've got a tenant that's locked in for a year, the rent's all paid, you don't have to worry about it. That's pretty much the only pro. There's a few cons here. The first con would be, this is a major red flag for me right off the bat, and I think we've talked about this previously. What are they looking to do? Why are they looking to pay upfront a full year? What is it that they're trying to get you to overlook? Is there something when you screen them that's going to turn up? Bad credit, criminal history, unpaid debt to a previous landlord, whatever the case may be. Is there something in their past that they're trying to get you to gloss over by waving a great big fat check in front of you? That's huge. That's definitely something that you're going to want to dig into. Make sure you do your due diligence on every application, but knowing that this person wants to pay, a one year's rent up front, I'm digging extra deep into that application just to make sure that I turn over every rock and don't miss something, some sort of a huge red flag that would be a cause for a denial. Even in the face of having 1 year's rent, waved in your face, always do your due diligence. So if they're bad tenant, if they turn out to be a bad tenant 2 months into the tenancy, you may have trouble evicting, even outside the eviction moratorium and everything else that are happening. Because you've accepted that 1 year of rent up front, you may find yourself having difficulty in getting this tenant evicted. Or at the very least, you may have to refund that tenant whatever the unused portion of the rent is as of the time of the eviction. So that's something to keep in mind too. If you were to get, let's say it's $1,000 a month rent, you get $12,000, you can't just go out and spend that $12,000. You might have to refund some of that to the tenant in the event that there's an eviction or something like that. So Is it worth it? That's a determination that you're going to have to make for yourself. At least in my opinion, dealing with a situation like this, number one, in New York, I wouldn't be able to do it anyway. But even back when we were able to do it, it was still something that we were always very, very skeptical of. You know, what is it that they're trying to get you to overlook? Are they trying to get you to just never come to the property because, oh, the rent's paid, I don't need to go chase that tenant? You know, what's happening inside the property once they move in, whatever the case may be. That being said, it's not necessarily a red flag. You may have somebody that came into an inheritance, came into a large sum of money from the sale of a business, came into a large sum of money for any number of reasons. Maybe they won the lotto, who knows? And they just want to pay that year of rent and not have to worry about writing a rent check every month. All right, it is what it is. Just make sure you're doing your due diligence. That's really the key on something like that. Going on to our next question, tenant caused lawn damage. Tenant put a large gazebo-like tent in the backyard for backyard parties. Well, now the tenant has moved out, taking his tent and leaving behind a large area that needs grass. Should I bill the tenant for reseeding or sod? This sounds to me like it would be something that you should be able to deduct as damages from the security deposit because it was damages caused during the tenancy by the tenant. I think it's this week's episode of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. We go in depth on lawn maintenance agreements, both from the tenant side as well as from the owner side, the landlord side, to determine who should be responsible for lawns and why you might want to go tenant responsible or why you might want to remain the responsible party for lawns. We go into that pretty in depth in the podcast this week, so you might want to check that out over at rentprep.com/podcast. But essentially, this lawn damage was created by the tenant or by the tenant's tent. So I would say that this should be a reasonable deduction. Realistically, if we're talking about, I don't know, it says a large area, but I have a gazebo pop-up tent that I use in my backyard that's, I think, 16 by 16. I wouldn't consider that a huge area. But it sounds to me like this is something that can be resolved more than likely with some grass seed and a bale of hay over the top of it so that it, stays moist and has a chance to grow without getting trampled on and things like that. I don't think it's going to be a major charge, but I definitely think that if the tenant caused the damage, then yeah, the landlord should probably be made whole on that. Last but not least, tenant delaying an inspection. I have a situation that you guys might be able to help with. We are in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas. We are trying to list our rental that is on a month-to-month lease. We have offered it to our current tenant, and she said she cannot qualify, so we asked her for a good day to do a walkthrough this week. We want to list it on Memorial Day. So they're talking about listing this home for sale. She is saying that we cannot come by until May 16 because her doctors want her to self-isolate for an impending surgery. Our lease says that we do not have to give notice for access, and we are giving multiple days notice. Would you offer to wear a filtered mask and open the house after we do a walkthrough, or wait until May 16? So this is an interesting one. There's a couple different tactics you could take here. I don't know what exactly the laws are for access to a unit in Texas, but I know here in New York it's 24 hours notice for a non-emergency event. If it's an emergency event, like a flood or something like that, even a medical emergency, that's direct access. It's knock and walk, basically. But if it's something like this where you're just doing an inspection, probably getting some marketing photos or whatever, this would be a 24-hour walkthrough, a 24-hour notice before you can walk through. So I would first go back to what does your lease say, followed by what do the state laws say. And once you have a wrap around that, then I would kind of start figuring out what tactic you want to take. Memorial Day is May 31st, so even if you wait until May 16th, you still have 2 full weeks before you list the home for sale. I guess my main question would be, if the tenant's having a surgery on the 16th, what about recovery after the surgery? Are you going to be able to get in there after the fact? Or is that going to cause an even further delay? Is this worth pushing to get in? Is the flip side to that coin? Ultimately, I guess that would be up to you. If it was our office and it wasn't an emergency scenario, I would probably push the inspection. People's health and safety is more important to me than taking some pictures for marketing purposes. That's kind of where I'm at. We are dealing with the middle of a pandemic. I think everybody needs to be a little bit more respectful of everybody's personal space when it comes to stuff like this. That being said, if you do need to go in, make sure you take all of the proper precautions. Maybe see if the tenant would prefer to step outside while you do your quick walkthrough, whatever the case may be, if you decide that you want to push the scenario. But I think that you have to have a conversation with the tenant and explain what you're trying to do, why you need to get in, how long you're going to be in, You know, if you're taking photos, why, and whatever the case may be. Obviously, the tenant understands the property's going up for sale, but I honestly think here, at least in this situation, the tenant's probably just trying to make sure that they're healthy for their surgery, especially if this is like an elective surgery or something like that, where it might have been something that was scheduled last year even, and they're just now getting to the point where they can get in for the surgery, because at least here in New York, electives were all shut down for, I think, 3 months, something like that. So this is one of those situations where you have to try to figure out what the best scenario is for everybody involved. If it was us, like I said, we would probably just wait and go in just the same as if somebody is COVID positive or COVID suspected positive. We would push a maintenance job out if it was a non-emergency. I would do the same exact situation here. I would talk to the tenant and see what the recovery time is going to be. If you're going to be able to get in on May 17th, which I think is the first Monday, you know, talk to the tenant, work through the situation, figure out what you need to do. If the tenant is stonewalling you at that point, then I would refer back to the lease and refer back to your state laws. That's kind of the situation as I see it. That's how I would lay it out. That's how I would handle it. Your mileage may vary, but good luck to you, and hopefully your sale goes great. That pretty much wraps things up for this week's episode of Ask a Property Manager. Thank you all so much for watching. We love producing Ask a Property Manager, and you can help us to improve by dropping a question in the comments, either on Facebook or YouTube, and your question may be picked up and answered in an upcoming episode. If you enjoyed this content, or if we brought some value to your day, please do us a favor and hit that thumbs up button. YouTube and Facebook both push videos based on community feedback, so every like, comment, subscribe, and share helps us to grow and reach more people. We'll be back next week on Wednesday, May 12th, 10 a.m. Eastern with another show you won't want to miss. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.